Hello everyone, my name is Tamás Bereczky. I am a patient advocate and a social psychologist, and my research field is patient organizations and patient advocacy. And in today's presentation I will talk to you about the importance and the various processes of patient engagement in pharmaceutical research and development and why it matters. Please listen to the presentation, and if you have any questions then you can reach me on my email address, which is here on the bottom of the screen, and also I will repeat the email address at the end of this presentation. And I'm happy to answer your questions and comments. Enjoy. In today's presentation I will discuss how the patient's voice can appear and should appear in research and development, and what patient organizations have been doing in advocacy and, as the title says, beyond advocacy, in order to make sure that there's meaningful patient participation in research and development. Here are my disclosures. It's important for me to point out that some of the segments or the slides were developed by Anja Hoffmann, David Terry and Jan Geisler, and that these materials have also been used by the European Patients Academy for Therapeutic Innovation, where I work, and with Pathwocats Consultancy. And otherwise there's not a lot that I can disclose. Let's begin with the question why we are talking about patient engagement, or patient involvement, as some other people call it, in the first place. We see, if we look at the research and development activities of companies and also of research institutions, that patient engagement is becoming more relevant and more important, increasingly important in the research and development of pharmaceuticals. First of all, companies are increasingly involving patients so that they can improve their development and research processes, but also authorities are increasingly listening to the patient voice and also request their input into the development of clinical trials and also into designing research and development processes. And to some extent this is also already reflected in the legislative frameworks that apply especially in Europe, but also in the United States. So it has become a priority area in order to make sure that the end users of pharmaceuticals also actually have a saying, have a voice in how pharmaceuticals are developed and researched, and also how clinical trials are conducted. So there are benefits of patient engagement for both sides, for both the industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and also the medical technology industry, but also there are benefits for patients. First of all, if we look at the benefits for industry, we can say that there's a more reliable identification of the unmet medical need, which ensures customer centricity for the companies that work in this field. Also, it is faster to conduct clinical trials if you include patients in the development, in the design of clinical trials and protocols. That also reduces the number of amendments and thereby shortens the time to market, as you will see in one of the next points as well. Also, patient engagement ensures that there are relevant patient-reported outcomes included in the research and development process. There's a quicker path to the market, there's a shorter time to market, and also there's a higher credibility of the results, and the results are also more sustainable. Now, if we look at the patient side, first of all, the real needs of the patients are addressed because they are this community, the patient community, knows best what is actually needed. Also, there are more feasible study protocols which can actually be implemented. Also, the endpoints are more relevant for the patients and the patient communities. This then makes new treatments available much faster, and also it can build a long-term relationship between the research community and also the companies and the patient communities on the other side. But there are additional benefits to patient engagement. First of all, we have to acknowledge that pharmaceutical companies and patients are in the same boat. And what their aims are, what they want to achieve, are really the two sides of the same coin. This means that it is actually much more meaningful to collaborate, which will also cut research waste. You know that there's a tremendous rate of waste in research, in pharmaceutical research and development. And we must also acknowledge that over the last 5 to 7 years, there has been a tremendous development in patient communities in order to upscale their skills and their knowledge, and in order to become real, meaningful partners in research and development. So this collaboration is actually, or has become, the key to better medicine. Within the European Patients Academy for Therapeutic Innovation, or shorter UPATI, my colleagues have developed a thorough analysis of the research and development pathway, or of this spectrum, how medicines come about, from setting research priorities through the design and planning of research, and also through conducting research and the operational aspects of that, up to market authorization and then the post-approval phase of pharmaceutical development and also registration. And not only did they look at this spectrum, but they also identified certain points where patient involvement, patient inclusion makes particular sense. So this practical roadmap, which has actually become a benchmark, so to say, for conducting patient engagement activities in companies and also in research institutions, this identifies various tasks and levels of involvement, or even loci of involvement, on two levels. Those which require a medium level of expertise, and also those which require a higher level of expertise. And also this chart gives you not inclusive but almost inclusive list of various specific tasks that patients can be included in when you look at the various stages or milestones of development of pharmaceuticals. Now, early involvement actually creates the highest impact, but we see today that involvement happens mostly at the later phases of the research and development process. Now, on the one hand, impact on the outcomes can be achieved much better the earlier the inclusion happens. However, what we see currently is that when companies or sponsors are already in the registration phase, they suddenly realize that the results must be verified by a patient organization, and then there's, or the patient community, and then there's a bit of scrambling to find patients or patient representatives or patient organizations that will do this verification, or that will, so to say, sign off the research that was done so far. Obviously, at that point, there's not much more that you can do. However, if you do patient inclusion in the early stages, that means that patients can meaningfully and purposefully influence the research and development process. And the objective, of course, should be shared leadership to the extent this is possible, and that's why there's a question mark after this term. and also co-creation. Co-creation has become the buzzword in patient engagement now, and that is indeed what we try to achieve, to co-create the research and development process and also the design of clinical trials, and also to do this through the entire life cycle of the medicine. Patient engagement is a powerful tool, and it also has a tradition that goes back to many years. And it started in the early days in the HIV and AIDS movement, when the so-called Denver Declaration, which was about the collaboration of patient communities and the industry in researching and developing drugs against AIDS. So already in this document, this key term or this key tenet that nothing about us without us was formulated. Many people claim that that they coined this slogan, but actually it was first described in the Denver Declaration by the AIDS community in the United States. The next major step in this process was when expanded access and compassionate use were introduced by the FDA in 1987. Once again, this was under pressure from patient communities, and then the accelerated approval process came about in 1992, once again introduced by the FDA for life-threatening conditions, because development and registration lead times were so long that patient communities were dying before medicine became available. So that's why the accelerated approval process was introduced. Again, this came from the HIV/AIDS tradition of advocacy. And also the use of surrogate markers instead of hard clinical endpoints, for example, in pivotal trials, which was then also adopted by the EMA in 1997. Again, in the HIV field, where today we look at the markers that will describe the status of the immune system rather than at hard clinical endpoints like death of the patient. Because we find that these surrogate markers give an equally good indicator of how the patient is progressing, whether his or her status is improving or not. There are some additional milestones that need to be mentioned, such as the introduction of new criteria for conditional approval, also how the so-called Lazarus effect on the dying patients in HIV led to a proof of cost effectiveness of expensive treatments. So that turned out, or it was proven, that expensive treatments can be cost effective because whole cohorts of people living with HIV could be kept alive for decades. Then there were some instances of cross-Atlantic lobbying for pivotal trials, including 2 experimental drugs, which was also a first and an unusual step at the time. Then the development of single tablet regimens, which involves the collaboration of various developers, sponsors, companies in order to bring their different compounds into one tablet, into one pill, which sounds simple today, but actually it was a major challenge to achieve in a system where companies work in a very siloed way. So it's very difficult legally, but also technologically and scientifically or it used to be quite difficult to bring these various aspects together and actually put active ingredients from various manufacturers into one pill. So this also was something that came from the patient community. It was proposed by the patient community, and then pressure came from the patient community to achieve this. Also tiered pricing and voluntary licenses. And the list goes on. If we look at cystic fibrosis, the description and discovery of extended use of personalized medicine was associated with work by patient communities and organizations in cystic fibrosis. Then therapy development in rare diseases, again driven by patient organizations. Then the indication spectrum, which has become very broad and now also includes advanced therapy medicinal products, which is again something that was proposed by patient organizations. And the list goes on if you look at the slide, and you can also see it for yourself. Now, if you look at the timeline, how it evolved, you will see how quickly the pace, the speed of this development picked up. So it started in 1992 with the FDA and the collaboration with the HIV movement, and then there were some milestones, and the closer we get to 2018, and then it continued in 2019, this which has not been included in this presentation yet. You will see that there have been some very important milestones, including European Union sponsored projects, large multi-million euro projects that aim at the implementation and development of patient engagement in research and development. This went together with a paradigm shift also in how we empower patients and how we teach them about medicines, research and development. It's been very clear from the early days on that without this kind of preparedness or this knowledge, it is hopeless for patient communities to participate meaningfully in this type of activities. They have to understand how medicines work, how biology works, what the illness or what the given disease does to the body, how the treatment influences the disease. So there's a vast amount of information that patient communities and patient advocates needed to absorb. And in order to facilitate that process, this was also acknowledged and recognized by the European Union and a number of other organizations. And this is how the European Patients Academy for Therapeutic Innovation, or UPATI as we call it, came about. It was launched in 2012 as a public-private partnership with 33 consortium members, at the time funded by the Innovative Medicines Initiative. Misha Goldman was the executive of the IMI at the time, whom you know very well, of course, also from this particular course. Ever since, UPATI has been developing and disseminating objective, credible, correct and up-to-date and unbiased public knowledge about medicines, research and development. Also, UPATI is building competencies and expert capacity among patients and the public. And so it has become a game changer and a driver of patient engagement in research and development, and has been continuing for the last 8 years and is still going very strong. There are various levels on which UPATI provides services in order to train up patients and lay people to participate in pharmaceutical research and development. First of all, there's the patient expert course, or patient expert training course, which is designed for patient experts or expert patients or patient advocates who are involved deeply in this type of activity, where they learn about a number of topics that are essential to be able to participate meaningfully. And also there's the UPATI toolbox, which is actually the website that contains a vast amount of information, more than 3,000 articles, entries, webinars, short videos, slide decks, all sorts of information already in all of these languages that you can see listed on the slide in order to facilitate this learning process and to provide this type of information to the general public. So if you look at the last 12 months of UPATI, it has been tremendously successful, and just one thing I would like to highlight here is the more than 3 million users since the launch of the website, or the toolbox as we call it. There's also the expert training course for patient advocates. Currently, it's the 4th expert training course that's running, and we are already working on preparing the 5th one. So far we have trained up 154 graduates, or people who graduated from UPATI, and we also follow up on their work and how their professional careers evolve. And we find that almost all of them have become successful contributors to research and development and science in their particular disease areas. There's a massive demand for this type of activity, we find. Meanwhile, we have already also launched UPATI in Japan, and there are negotiations going on to launch this type of activity in some other countries of the world, including Canada and even Brazil. I've already mentioned this. There are various types of content items, and because originally these contents were developed from European taxpayer money, so everything is available free of charge under a Creative Commons license. So you're free to use any of these materials for non-commercial purposes. You should, of course, give credit to UPATI and the authors that are indicated occasionally on the website or when you use the materials. Of course, we also have to pay attention to making sure that the information that UPATI provides is objective and is reliable and unbiased, which is not always a very easy or straightforward thing to do. Therefore, UPATI has designed from the very beginning a very thorough and detailed content development process that makes sure that all stakeholders, and by all stakeholders I mean academia, the pharmaceutical industry, patient communities and regulators, so that these 4 stakeholders are all equally represented in the content development groups or committees, review boards, editorial board of UPATI, to make sure that all the relevant perspectives are always reflected, and that the information that comes out of UPATI is actually scientifically sound and also completely unbiased. So what is it that actually patient advocates do? And this is a question we get oftentimes. What happens in a patient organization? So what do they do? And there are massive differences across regions and countries. But generally speaking, we can say that what patient organizations do is they support patients, they support fellow patients. In some countries, like Germany, this is the strongest aspect of the work of patient organizations. They provide information, support, psychosocial support. They also navigate patients in the healthcare system and help them to find their ways through the system. As a second area, patient organizations also work in health policy, so they influence health policy and also patient care. And they also work in research. That's the third area where they are active. So they contribute in partnership, they contribute to science in partnership with clinicians, networks, and the industry. Now, the landscape of patient organizations has become very varied, as you may deduct from the previous slide and from this rather expansive field of activity. There are specific peer support groups that do nothing else but this kind of support or psychosocial support activity. But there are also strong lobby groups and advocacy groups out there in patient advocacy. There are health leagues, umbrella organizations and associations that are all active in research policy and to some extent also training. Some of these organizations do a lot of additional training work for their patient communities, and they're already present and available, but also for their upcoming cohorts of patient activists and advocates. So there may be a variation on how patient groups are composed. There can be groups where only patients are participating. There might be others where clinicians, patients and carers work together. One example is listed here as the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. There are yet others where industry and patients work together, or patient organizations that were kick-started by the industry in order to have that base of patients with whom the industry can then work together in research and development, and then they become independent, and then so they develop, and then they can spin off this structure. And also these organizations evolve over time, and they may change their composition as well. This also means that when you choose a partner to collaborate with, you must first identify and understand what type of group is it, what is it that they want to do, what are the objectives. Also, you should consider whether whatever work you want to do, should this happen with an umbrella or on a local level, with a local or a national, or with a disease-specific organization. Do you need a league? Do you need an alliance or an umbrella? Or do you need a local group of patients that can provide the information or the collaboration that you need? And also, because it has become such a complex and an increasingly specialized landscape, it is important that you do some background checking before you start working with patient organizations and with patient umbrellas in order to understand how they can be useful for your work and for your purposes. So, as I said, the landscape has changed tremendously, and the time when patient organizations were just a bunch of people sitting together Saturday evening and chatting over tea or complaining about healthcare systems or whatnot, this situation is over. And on this slide I have shown, just as an illustration, the logos of a bunch of really strong, large, multi-million-dollar or multi-million-euro patient organizations that are out there in the field and do some tremendously important work, including participation in research and development, but also leading their own patient-led community science projects and research projects, which is a tremendously interesting field. So this process of emancipation of patients and of patient organizations has led to a level, or has taken us to a level, where patient organizations can effectively engage in their own research projects and can fundraise for clinical trials, develop protocols for clinical trials, which is a completely different level of involvement from what we saw, say, 10 or 15 years ago. This also means that, of course, patient organizations pay a lot of attention to making sure that they are credible, so that whatever information, whatever input comes out of a patient organization is credible and useful. So a patient will know from his or her lived experience what it means to live with a given disease. So it doesn't make much sense to teach them, but instead we always recommend to listen to them and to ask for their input. What is this lived experience, and how can that be useful for your work if you want to work in medicines research and development, but also in registration. The priorities of a patient or of a patient community might be different from what clinicians see as an ideal priority or as an ideal outcome. For example, a physician might value increased survival times, while this may not necessarily be the most important for a patient. Maybe a patient is ready to live for a shorter time, but that lifespan should be a livable life. So the quality of life should be appropriate, and instead of being bedridden for several more months, maybe the patient is ready to live a little shorter, but wants to have a quality of life that allows him or her, for example, to say goodbye to their loved ones. And also, a patient is the ultimate user of the medicine that you develop. So, of course, he or she should have a say in the risk-benefit assessment, which is an important aspect of the development and the registration process, because they might have different priorities. And they also should be trusted in terms of what is the feasible and acceptable route of application of a medicine, for example, because otherwise you will increase the rate of non-adherence. And there are some brilliant examples for this. When companies developed, and also scientists developed routes of application which were very reasonable and also very good in terms of delivering the drug into the patient's body, but the patients were not involved and didn't have a say in how this should happen. And the ultimate result was that it turned out that they did not want to use that medicine in the way that was proposed by the company, and so they had to pull it from the market because nobody purchased it, even though it was a truly good and working medicine. But the route of administration was not the right one. So, in order to facilitate this process, UPATI has also developed a series of guidance documents which have been published in a peer-reviewed journal in Frontiers in Medicine. 4 such guidance documents exist currently. One is about industry-led research and development, the other is patient involvement in health technology bodies. The third is patient involvement in regulatory processes, and the fourth is about patient involvement or patient engagement in ethics committees. All of them highly relevant, and I recommend that you download these from the internet, from the Frontiers in Medicine website, and you read through them. They are short, concise, and very easy to use, and give a list of recommendations on how patient engagement can be done in a meaningful way. Ultimately, clinical trials are a quantitative research experiment. You have patients that go into the clinical trial, something happens to them, and then hopefully the largest portion of them comes out with an ideal result. Some of them will die, and some of them will have outlying results. And we measure and use the statistics in order to understand what happens in the clinical trial. So if you take this with such a simple approach, and I know, of course, that it then can become extremely complicated, but on a very basic level, this is what happens. And if you start from this point, then that also allows you to work with the patients in a very easy, meaningful way, because you will find that actually you can reuse your explanations and clarify your concepts and explanations in order to make them understandable for the patients as well, who usually are to some extent lay persons. And if you can do that, that will also help your own research process, and will also help your own thinking, because it will force you to use Occam's razor and to simplify your approach to whatever experiment or to whatever project you're doing. There are some institutional frames for doing patient involvement or patient engagement. One such tool is the Community Advisory Board, which is a group of patient experts who offer expertise to public or private sponsors. These come primarily from the HIV and the CML and hematology and the rare diseases fields, but community advisory boards are spreading now quickly across disease areas. This is always the same group that will advise several sponsors, so it's a standing board with a certain number of members who will participate in meetings. What is key is that the agenda and the organization of the meetings are driven by the patients. So this is a patient-led initiative. It's not the sponsor, it's not the public or the private or the company sponsor that will say what the agenda should be, but it's the patients that decide what they want to talk about, and then there's a consultative process with the participant companies or sponsors in order to clarify the various points. And also it allows an in-depth dialogue with a very high level of patient experts who work in the field. Patients are also not perfect, and patient organizations are not necessarily perfect. So what we try to teach to them, and you should also understand this is the perspective where patient organizations come from, that advocacy is risky business, and there are certain ways how this can go wrong. One is when we keep chairs warm and we just go to meetings because they are interesting, but really don't make a difference, which is something that should be avoided. Also, patient organizations can be very territorial, and because it's always about who gets more funding, and there's this unhealthy competition across disease areas, but also within disease areas, and rivalry. So that's again something that you should be aware of when you work with patient organizations. Also, there's a lot of blaming others, disqualifying by being too emotional or being off topic and not being well informed. So you should always come from the perspective that patient organizations are not companies, they are not corporate entities. Most of the time, even though they are well developed and they are in some instances quite large by now, but they are civil society organizations that rely very heavily on volunteer work and on civil society processes. And also there might be a large turnover in patient organizations, which you should also be aware of. So when you work with patient organizations, be prepared that some people will stay around for a longer time, some other people may pass away, or they burn out and they stop and they re-engage again. So there's always a coming and going in patient organizations. And also another thing that we should avoid is barking up the wrong tree, which means that we don't advocate on the right place. So you always have to decide where you want to work. Is this the level of the EU, or is this the national level where your work needs to be done? So you have to understand where the various levels of authority lay. So you should know your own trees, and you should bark up the right tree. For this, you need to understand what the various areas are and what the various levels of responsibility are in order to really make an impact. And why I'm talking about this is because in the end it all comes together into what we call evidence-based advocacy. So evidence-based advocacy means actually advocating in a targeted, evidence-based, so scientifically sound evidence is meant here, well-educated and professional manner. And during this, you also measure the impact and the outcomes of what we do or what you do. So all of that, what I've explained so far, comes together in this very simple concept that whatever you do should be based on scientific evidence, should be based on data, and then you do your own analysis to this data and generate the evidence that you need in order to underpin your political arguments. So this is targeted advocacy based on really good data and also packaged in the right way. And this is what we do currently in patient organizations and in patient umbrellas. There are some areas where meaningful data can be generated by patient organizations, by patient groups very easily. This is, for example, adherence to therapies, where you can do thorough surveys, and usually we get better results than when the same surveys are done by clinicians or sociologists, which does not exclude that patients work together with statisticians, biostatisticians, or sociologists in the survey design, but how the survey is designed is then largely influenced by the patients, and thereby the results are also better. Or when we talk about inequalities in access or care patterns, then the disease-related outcomes is again something where patient organizations can provide very good insight. Patient preferences and also real-world patient relevant outcomes, for example, in quality of life, which can be done through investigator-initiated studies and surveys, once again with patient involvement. So if we recap on that famous development spectrum that I already presented before, and we look at this in some more detail, then you will see in the next slides where patient organizations or patients can actually make a really impactful input. If you look at the stage of the protocol design, for example, there increasing patient relevance, the value for patients, also patient-related or patient-relevant outcomes by providing input about risk and benefit, what are the endpoints that are relevant to patients, which quality of life or patient-relevant outcomes instruments should be used, mobility, logistics, the route of administration, all of this can be areas where patient communities can really make a very good input. Or if you look at patient information, and you will remember that the upper half of this spectrum is where high expertise is needed, and the lower half is where medium expertise is needed. So generating patient information or improving patient information is, for example, something where medium expertise is sufficient from the patient community. Improving the participant information will also improve inclusion in the clinical trial and also retention in the clinical trial. So again, this is something that might be very important. Another area, if you look at health technology assessment, and this is something that happens now extensively across the European Union, especially to some extent also in the United States. Here, patient involvement can provide a human context to decision makers, which helps them to frame their decisions and interpret the value that is represented to the patients. Also, important questions can be answered more easily. First of all, these important questions will be asked by the patients during the HTA process. It addresses gaps, improves transparency, legitimacy, and also the relevance of decision making. Or if you look at post-study communication, which is already in the market authorization and post-approval stage of the medicine life cycle, then you will see that this information is more easily disseminated by patients. This flow of information in the pharmacovigilance process can be facilitated by patients group very easily. It improves the doctor-patient communication if you include the patients in this process, and also it will give input into guidelines, or it can drive the adoption of guidelines for treatment procedures. So let me show you a few examples about why we use patient-generated evidence. And one such good example is from the CML community, the chronic myeloid leukemia community, where we know that you must be highly adherent to your treatment in order to be able to live a long and healthy life with CML. You have to take your drugs every single day, and if you do so, then after a while you may also come off drugs, and then your status needs to be monitored. However, we also see that a number of patients, a relatively large number of patients, fail on their treatment, and we know that the only reason for their failure is because they are non-adherent to their treatment. Now, on the one hand, doctors say that their patients are always adherent. This is cancer, and they take it seriously. Of course, they are adherent. So why do people say that they are not? While on the other hand, we also see treatment failures, and we know that the reason for treatment failures is that patients are not adherent. So there's this contradiction which the CML community wanted to understand better. So they launched a global survey project in which they asked 2,151 people online and 395 people on paper. They used a medical research agency to support their work, to design the study together, so co-creation, you know, that's the word. Actually, the results were very much against what clinicians and healthcare professionals always said. They found that 21% of CML patients were low adherent, 46% were medium adherent, and only 33% were highly adherent. So obviously in these two categories, the low and medium adherent patients, there's an increased risk of treatment failure. And then they started considering why this can be the reason, and how this, why this comes about, why patients don't take their treatment, and that then contributed to the further development of the treatment paradigm. Also, this survey was done in a way to make sure that it is KOL proof. KOL is key opinion leader, so that's leading clinicians in the field. So they ran a pilot first. They also used a research agency. They used a validated tool, which costs money, but it's absolutely necessary. And they did it in several languages, and also the tool was validated for these languages. They used their global network for to reach this large amount of CML patients. And also they participated, or they cooperated with 4 clinical networks and did some of the surveys on paper in order to remove the online bias. Now, another example is a pilot run by the AMA with the participation of the Melanoma Patient Network, so Skin Cancer, Myeloma Patients Europe, which is the umbrella organization for myeloma patients, and the European Medicines Agency. And they try to understand how individual patients value benefits and risks, whether there are groups of patients with similar values in this population, so melanoma and myeloma, and what type of evidence is useful for regulators. And so they found that while responses were all over the place, but there are certain clusters, and that these clusters can be associated with the different diseases, but also with the different stages of the diseases. And obviously, while there is a clear preference towards overall survivor, so you can see that it's skewed to the left, where the overall survival axis is. But also there's a clear preference towards severe short-term side effects rather than moderate chronic side effects. So patients want to have a treatment that's maybe brutal but works quickly, rather than to live with a treatment that causes mild side effects but lasts very long. And another example is what happened in the myeloma patient community again, where they looked at the preferences or the evaluation of side effects of treatments. It's interesting to see, just to highlight one example, that physicians, and I apologize for this mismatch here, physicians is the blue line, that physicians thought that neuropathy is the most important side effect. For the patients, it turns out that's not the most important side effect. For them, hair loss, decreased body function, and also neuropathy are the most important side effects. So there might be a mismatch in this, and this needs to be respected as well in the research and development process, or when clinical trials are designed. Also, the European Cancer Patient Coalition participated very intensively in understanding and revising the clinical trials directive of the EU. So they analyzed the whole process, how information flows between patients and the various stakeholders in the process, and so they found that this process was extremely complicated and non-transparent, and their proposals were then integrated into the simplification process of this of how the clinical trials directive has been designed. And my last example is about the Myeloma Patients Europe Access Atlas, as it is called. The atlas discusses various countries and treatments, and the barriers to treatment in the given countries. So if you look at the list of countries and the various treatment options and barriers to these treatment options, you will see that the redder a country, the worse the situation, and the greener the country, the better the situation. And this chart, which is then updated on a regular basis, this chart is based on solid data which has been collected from the network of myeloma patient organizations. Then the participants were coached about how this tool should be used. A strategy, an advocacy strategy has been built up on this basis, and now it's being used as an active advocacy tool. So you see, I hope that with these examples I could highlight some of the key areas how patients can be meaningfully involved in research and development, and also in clinical trials, and why this makes sense. And I also wanted to highlight to you that this actually doesn't happen in a vacuum anymore, but there's a whole infrastructure of patient education and patient organizations of support, policy, advocacy, training, and also scientific research work going on in patient communities that will bolster this activity and will allow that through patient organizations and through the involvement of trained patient experts, this unique knowledge, which is rooted in the lived experience, and which is rooted in the grassroots connections of patient experts to their communities, can lead to better outcomes, to more meaningful outcomes, faster research and development processes, shorter times to market, and also much more relevant outcomes for the patients themselves. So thank you very much for your attention.